delighted to be hosting this evening's program on behalf of the Mark Twain House and Museum right here in Hartford, Connecticut. I've spent some time with our guests tonight in the green room just now, and I promise you we are in for one fun evening. Excuse me. I just swallowed wrong. I won't talk too long because I know you're eager to get to hear what our guests have to say. I just have a little bit of housekeeping work to do. First of all, we are in Crowdcast tonight, as we've been doing in our virtual programs since the very beginning of the pandemic. 2 years ago, we ran our first virtual program, and we've done hundreds of them since then. And we've been delighted to welcome audiences from all over the world and from our local community as well. So I see that you're already chatting away in the chat. Please continue to do that. But if you have a question for either of our guests or all three of our guests, please do me the favor of posting your questions in the Ask a Question area that you see at the bottom of your screen. We'll come to the Q&A about 2/3 of the way through the program tonight. And again, if you post your question down there, it's more likely to be seen. And another thing is that if you want to look at the questions that other people have posted and upvote a question, that moves it to the top of the pile. So thank you for your help with that. Also in the chat, you'll see a couple of links. One is an opportunity to purchase your very own signed copy of the book that we're talking about tonight, What Would Mrs. Astor Do? Dr. Tichi, or as she's asked me to call her, Cecilia, has provided book plates and will be selling those signed copies through that link. So we know that you can purchase this book elsewhere for sure, but do know that if you make that purchase by clicking that link, number one, you do get the signed copy, and number two, your purchase benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. Another link in the chat allows you to buy 2 books at once. The book that we just mentioned and another of Dr. Tichi's books, Gilded Age Cocktails. And in a moment, some of our speakers will be holding up a copy of that for you to see. So please take advantage of those opportunities. While we're looking at the bottom of the screen in the Ask a Question area, I'd ask you just kind of lift your gaze a tiny bit to that button that tells you that your support is vital. That has been true throughout the pandemic, and it remains true as the pandemic continues and we begin to maybe see the light at the end of the tunnel. These programs have been delightful to produce and to offer, and the staff has really enjoyed the opportunity to share so many speakers and bring so many authors to talk about their new books. Rarely has a museum that charged an admission fee or a registration fee for any of these programs, which might lead you to believe that these programs are free to produce, but they are not. There are costs associated with the virtual programs, as with any program. So if you've enjoyed our programs in the past, if you enjoyed tonight's program, which I hope you will, if you've been looking forward to future programs, which you can learn more about at marktwainhouse.org, please consider helping support the production of these programs by clicking that donate button, and know that every single penny that you donate is very deeply appreciated by the staff and the Board of Trustees, and every single penny is put to very, very good use indeed. I'd like to thank our sponsors. Tonight's program, like all of our virtual programs, is sponsored by the Wish You Well Foundation and by Connecticut Public WNPR. It's produced in part with support honoring the legacy of Frank Lord, who was a much beloved trustee of the museum, who passed away sadly last year. And the museum is delighted to honor his memory through these virtual programs. And again, if you want to learn more about upcoming programs, please visit marktwainhouse.org. Tonight's program is moderated by the Mark Twain House and Museum's Executive Director, Pieter Roos. Now, before Pieter came to the Mark Twain House and Museum, he was the longtime director of the Newport Restoration Foundation. And this is a man who knows an awful lot about the Gilded Age and about rich people in Newport. So he's the perfect person to be talking with our speakers tonight. We have with us Cecilia Tichi, a return guest. We've had her before and are delighted to have her back. She's the award-winning author and faculty member at Vanderbilt University. Her books span American literature and culture from colonial days to modern times, but more recently draw upon the Gilded Age that prompted her book on Jack London and another on 7 activists in that tumultuous era. Tichi's What Would Mrs. Astor Do? A complete guide to the manners and mores of the Gilded Age segues to her new mystery series, A Gilded Death. And we have a copy of that here for you to look at, together with Murder, Murder, Murder in Gilded Central Park and A Fatal Gilded High Note. So we're delighted to welcome Dr. Tichi back. And we are so excited to have a very special guest tonight, Donna Murphy. She's an award-winning actress. She's named by New York Magazine as one of the 3 living legends of the New York theater. And of course, she can currently be seen as part of the star-studded cast of HBO's new original series, The Gilded Age, by Downton Abbey creator Julian Fellowes. And she plays, of course, Mrs. Caroline Astor. Please, everybody, join me in welcoming our guests, Pieter Roos, Cecilia Tichi, and Donna Murphy.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you.
And I am so excited to have both of you here today. This is really great. We don't usually have the pleasure of interviewing 2 people at once. But Donna, it has been just a huge pleasure to watch you play Mrs. Astor. As a professional historian and museum director, I spend an awful lot of my career sort of picking up the pieces after bad popular history. And this program, I'm sure in part because it comes from Julian Fellowes, who's a little bit of a nut for historical accuracy, is really great. I have really enjoyed watching it, and I'm looking forward to future seasons. And Cecilia, you have created a handbook for the 400. It's a 21st century user's guide to a time that is thick with ceremony and ritual and secrets and unwritten rules. And for all of you that have been watching the series, you know what I'm talking about. So I want to start with a question for Donna to tell us how you prepared personally for this role. It is a different time period, and it's a very different kind of thing.
Yes, I've played quite a few women in the 19th century, but most of those characters, both on stage and on screen, seem to be more placed around the time of the Civil War in the 1860s. This was the first, well, I did a show, Hello, Dolly, on Broadway, and that is a little bit later shift and a very different tone. And she certainly didn't give a hoot about what Mrs. Astor would think, Dolly Gallagher Levi. But I love research. So when this project came up, and I was given the opportunity to meet and audition for it, I was thrilled with the possibilities. And when I was cast, to me, it was just like, oh, goody, 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 goody. Here we go. Because I just love immersing myself and taking in as much as I can about a world. And when I'm playing a historical figure, which I have in the past, I played Mary Todd Lincoln in a film for TNT. I played some characters who are not famous characters, but who were actual, living humans on this planet. An HBO film that I did. I played a contemporary woman in a family drama, and a Southern woman named Jane Greenwood in a series that I did for PBS called Mercy Street. So you feel an extra sense of responsibility when you are playing a person who actually walked on this earth and may have descendants who exist at this time, and just there is you want to honor that life, and yet you have a responsibility to the choice of how the story is being told and what part you play in that storytelling, whatever medium you're doing. So with Mrs. Astor, she was one of the few historical characters. Most of the characters are fictional. And as we discussed a little bit earlier, there are certain characters who are very heavily influenced by some actual historical characters. Bertha Russell on the show carries a lot of all the Vanderbilts' history and characteristics, and certainly the dynamic between Caroline Astor and Bertha Russell mirrors some of what went on between the Vanderbilts and the Astors and the women in that family. So I started with the text I was given, which is what I always do. I read a script over and over and over and over and over. And in this situation, this production company did a tremendous job in taking responsibility for really preparing everybody so that everybody would be on the same page about the etiquette of the time, approaching language, and the etiquette being everything from how you ate to how your tone of voice, the way that you would behave with a servant, the way that you would respond to certain kinds of behavior or commentary. And we had etiquette coaches, and we did seminars with them, coaching sessions. We're about to do a review for some of us who are coming back. And given whatever the plot is asking of us, the circumstances that we find ourselves in, that the characters find themselves in, there are different things that we really need to be knowledgeable about how we would handle ourselves, how our characters would handle ourselves. And of course, there's a distinct class system, and you know, the people who were playing servants, they had separate seminars, or if you will, that they would sit down with the coaches for them that were teaching them about cooking, about serving, and we were being served and being told, you know, which fork you would use and how you would hold a wine glass. The amount of detail, I'm kind of picking out the most obvious kinds of things, but the amount of detail was kind of staggering, because we all were thinking, my God, we have to remember all these things. You know, it's particularly in scenes where we're eating, we all go, oh dear God, please, let me handle this right. But with Mrs.
It's a foreign culture.
It really
it's not
is.
our culture anymore.
No,
Nope.
it's not. But there was quite a bit of information for me to draw upon for Mrs. Astor, both her own words. She did very few interviews, but there were. She was certainly, as you quoted her earlier in a personal conversation we were having in the green room. But also she did do I think it was a New York Times interview a little bit later in her life. And then in a number of publications, including this one, which I definitely was one of my Bibles, and extremely helpful to me, Cecilia. And there were other books as well, A Season of Splendor by Greg King, and Society as I Have Found It by, of course, the Ward McAllister, who is a character in our show, another historical character, and was very much attached for some time at the hip to Caroline Astor. So the challenge was, there's a lot of, the story is not about Mrs. Astor. You know, she is not the central character. She is a very necessary character, as we were talking about. If you're going to talk about the Gilded Age, if you're going to tell the story, a story about that time, you need to represent her. I suppose you could have a fictional representation of her, but it would be tricky if you were going to have any other historical characters. And so I'm fortunate that she's a very necessary figure in the storytelling. And I found her to be a very complicated woman. And the fact that she had a lot of personal difficulties that she was dealing with in her family life, very absent husband who was misbehaving, certainly by her own standards and the rest of society's, but she, as many women did at that time, and as society women were expected to do, you didn't speak of certain things. I mean, unless you were a gossip. And she had as I don't know, superficial as some of the things that she seemed to stand for and insist upon could be interpreted to be. She felt she had a sense of integrity about her, I think. And she she wanted there to be a sense of dignity and a sense of pride about who you were and who you came from, and she was not one to really become intimate with many people. She kept a distance, and I think that was one way of not becoming engaged in the dirt. And the truth is, she had enough dirt happening in her own family, which we haven't really gotten into in the series, and I can't really speak to what we will do in the future. But as an actor, I have all that information, so I know that this woman carries a lot of weight of just everything that she owns and that she lives with and she comes home to, and yet must maintain this presence and this persona that is almost impenetrable, regardless of what is said, regardless of what happens, more so than almost anyone else in society at that time.
One of my favorite lines in the whole series to that point is when your character says, "If there are no standards, what's the point of me?" And it's, that's right. And I think maybe, can we go over to Cecilia for a minute and ask you to just talk about, sort of as a historian, what was Mrs. Astor's role in the 400? Because it's such an outsized role.
Well, first, and it's so interesting, Donna, to hear you say that you were responsible to the character, to the authenticity of the character, bearing in mind descendants of the family, but also fidelity to the story that's being told. It's really a double role, an extraordinarily challenging one. And I said to you that when I saw that there is an actual Mrs. Astor in this HBO series, I thought that is the most challenging role to play. I have brought along Ward McAllister, Mrs. Astor's Chamberlain, his memoir, Society as I Have Found It. It is a trove for a historian. It also did him in because once the 400, Mrs. Astor and all of the society of Newport, of New York, with trips obviously abroad to the United Kingdom, to France, to have fittings at the famous couturiers, Worth in Paris, Redfern in London. That set did not want to see in this book a manual, a how-to manual of how to get into society. But I've turned to, please bear with me for a moment, the page in which, and it's pretty deep in the memoir, in which Ward McAllister, Savannah born, from a genteel family, summers in Newport, but not higher society, but an aesthetic sensibility from boyhood, we have to admit. Some time in California as a lawyer, but appalled by the vulgarity, the Barbary pirates, always yearning to create the society which I would say, as a social engineer, he was able to create once he saw that Caroline Astor had the makings of the leader of her generation in society. Wall Street would make the money and she would teach everyone how to spend it. So here's what Ward McAllister says about her. She possessed great administrative power. It was soon put to good use and felt by society. I then, for the first time, was brought in contact with this grande dame, italics, and at once recognized her ability and felt she would become society's leader and that she was admirably qualified for the position. A few more lines. It was not long before circumstances forced her to assume the leadership, which she did and which she has held with marked ability ever since. Now, this passage goes on and on and on. He called her a queen, and the mystic rose. She loved American Beauty roses. There were vases, crystal vases, all over her homes, everywhere, every room, and calling her the mystic rose, and mystic because, as Donna told us, in the role of Mrs. Astor, you never quite knew what was behind that gracious demeanor. The misbehaving husband was a flagrant philanderer. The men had their mistresses in the New York harbor on their yachts. When Mrs. Astor was asked about her yachting experience, she said, "Oh, my husband, William, I have been so fortunate in my marriage. He is so good to me, but what a terrible sailor am I, never to have set foot on the deck." So essentially, the life in the yacht in the harbor all night, and the name of the yacht, it's a double name in Arabic. It can mean light of the dawn, or it can mean the harem. And so in the harbor, and then one more of what Donna has referred to as the surround of difficulty, of the burden that this woman bore as her family misbehaved. A daughter of hers struck up an affair. Her last name was Drayton in her marriage. The affair was with an insurance executive, Barawi, and the love letters of increasing intimacy found their way into the newspaper. There was a divorce, it's the scandal, and all of society wondered. Mrs. Astor, who loathed divorce, who would not have at her table or at her ball or at her dinners anywhere, a divorced couple, and here was her daughter, and everyone wondered, what now? At the next reception, everyone at the front door, 640 Fifth Avenue, and there was Mrs. Astor side by side with her divorced daughter, welcoming the guests, and all was well from then on. And so there's a lot to learn and to uncover in this period. And this period, everyone should know this, is often called the New Gilded Age. It's been for about 20 years in the press, in social media, on TV. We are in a new Gilded Age, and it behooves us to look back and see what the original was, and we are.
One of the conventions of the time period was to change your clothes more frequently than you have a glass of water. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, because it is a feature in both your book, Cecilia, you talk about clothing quite a bit, and it's certainly very well honored in the TV show, how frequently all of the characters are changing for this and for that and for the other thing. Talk to us a little bit about the costuming, Donna. There's some clothing there that must weigh almost as much as you do. And tell us a little bit about it, because it's awfully well done.
Well, our costume designer, Kasia, is a brilliant designer, and she was impeccable in her research, and most of the upper society women's fabrics were sourced from Europe. I mean, they toured Europe in searching for fabrics, and she has a lot of material for research, but she wanted to do her own thing, and she also had an eye towards just twisting things a little bit, to particularly with the new moneyed characters, to exaggerate a bit the aspect of just how far they would go. They would go further, and it was more. I don't really want to put a label on it. It was more. It was just more. But it was all done so beautifully and exquisitely, and the care that was taken I had each of us, each of the principal women of the society, women anyway, we had our own couture dressmakers,
Mm.
and some of them worked in the top costume shops here in the city, and the gentleman who was my dressmaker was from Paris, and he's been here in the States for some time, but was just an incredibly knowledgeable man and gifted dressmaker. And the designs that she would present to me, and she always presented me with a whole board of what the inspirations for the actual design was, both for the fabric and for the cut and any accessories. And then, but she was also very generously collaborative. If I might mention something that maybe came from my research, remember we were working on the ball gown, and Mrs. Astor had something, I'd never heard this expression before, a stomacher, if that's how you actually say it.
That's
But
correct pronunciation, yeah.
a piece that is worn at the waist, that's sort of like a half belt, bejeweled, and hers was, had many, many diamonds on it, and it said that she, it contributed to her appearing to look like a chandelier, a walking chandelier. And so we were working with this dress, this beautiful black gown that had gold trim, and it was going to go, she had a certain vision of it initially, and as we put it together on me, she was questioning certain things. And then I said, I just would love to get some jewels on this dress. And we started taking jewelry that had been created for me, that were different samples that they had recreated in Europe for the character. And we started just placing them in different places on the dress. And I said, it's not that we necessarily have to have that stomacher piece. I think we maybe will at some point see it. But it was a way to pay homage to what I knew about her. And Keisha was just so both incredibly precise and opinionated herself. And I mean, if we were putting a hat on in the wig trailer in Newport, and she was doing a fitting in New York, you FaceTimed with her so that she could help make sure it was placed at exactly the angle she wanted it, and a hairstyle that was, whatever hair was visible was styled in a way that these things were not done on the spot. They were planned and worked out. We would have multiple fittings, which is not common in film and television. And I've done, even in period work, when I did The Day Lincoln Was Shot, when I did Mercy Street, maybe you had a couple of fittings. There just wasn't the time, the money, the resources for it. And HBO really gave a lot of incredible resources and funding, so that the kind of care and detail for so many costumes. I mean, it's not like we did this for one costume. We did this, for so many costumes for me, and then for each of these different characters. It was remarkable. I've worn, again, quite a bit. I've worn quite a few hoop skirts. And when I did The King and I on Broadway, the combination of the ball gown skirt and the hoop underneath it and the petticoats weighed close to 40 pounds. That was just from the waist down. And I had to not only speak in it, but I had to sing in it and dance in it and start on the floor speaking and start singing and rise up, dragging my 40 pounds. And I remember at one point there was like a sort of a suction action that happened, and I could not pick myself up off the floor during the fitting, and I burst into tears because it looked so beautiful and I wanted to be able to do what we'd staged, but I said, how are we going to do this? It was a challenge, and and Kelly O'Hara, who won the Tony Award for the most recent production of The King and I, where she played Mrs. Anna, she and I had several conversations about being in the corset and being in the hoop skirt and singing and dancing. And the difference here is that when you're on a set, you might be in it for 14 hours.
Mm.
And the intention was to be as true to the period as possible. And so those corsets, everybody was corseted. The servants were corseted. Now they were not as tight as, I mean, certainly they weren't trying to make me look like a 22-year-old. And Mrs. Astor was a rounder woman than I am. But we took certain liberties, you know, to not go as far as we could have gone in cinching me, but it was, the weight in that period was all in back of you because of
Yeah,
the bustles.
The bustles were huge.
Exactly, the bustles and the trains.
And the object was to have an 18-inch waist. My great-grandmother had an 18-inch waist when she really got packed into the corset. And it's dreadful. You know, women didn't play the flute or wind instruments because they couldn't get the breath to do it.
They were lucky they could speak, is all I can say. They were lucky that they could speak and stand and not faint, but you know, fainting was not uncommon in that time. And they were so restricted on so many levels, but just talking about the physical right here. So it was a challenge to be in the costumes for long periods of time. I had some experience with it, so it wasn't as, I think, intense or as shocking an experience for me as it was for some of the younger actresses who had never done period work on film before, if they'd done it on stage. But the thing is, these costumes were so beautiful and so glorious, and they were such an important part of the transformation that each of us felt in the merging of ourselves traveling to becoming these characters. And
Can I ask a question? Could I ask a question? Forgive me, Peter, may I ask a question, which is about this very issue? I agree. Those costumes are stunning. And all the fan groups, the HBO fan groups, and I'm in 2 or 3 of them, and the remarks, the plaudits for the costumes are so great. Has it ever come up among those of you in the cast that you are in a sort of competition with your costumes? That is, that the drama of the story as it progresses can sometimes be a rival to the elegance and glamour of these costumes. Has that ever come up?
you know, I've never heard an actress or actor, but obviously we're talking more about the women here. I've never heard any conversation like that. I think
Thank you.
that we just accepted that this was such a part of the time, and also for our production, there was a certain celebration of it, and so maybe taking it a bit further in places, and that would be part of the delight for an audience. We didn't think of ourselves as being upstaged by our costumes. We thought of ourselves as being enhanced, and our characterizations being enhanced by our costumes.
Thank
I
you.
remember Laurence Olivier once saying that his characters always truly came into their own once he got to put on the costume. And
Absolutely.
and I am so used to, having been in Newport for 24 years, I am so used to being in this architecture. I know so much of this history, and yet when I see these costumes and these people, when I saw the waltzing couples in the final episode of the season, it was absolutely remarkable. It transformed the history into living history for me. And to your point earlier about how the costume designers had a little story of their own going on. Your costume contrasting with Bertha Russell's costume is a great example of Mrs. Astor loved all of the best couture from Worth. And that famous Carolus Duran portrait of her in full battle dress is one that hung in her front hall and that she used to greet people under. So Cecilia, want to talk a little bit, sort of a little bit more of an overview about costume in that time period or clothing in that time period?
Well, I think I mean, Donna has just told us so much and it's been just wonderful. I would only add that in that period, one could barely dress and undress by oneself. One needed the valet, the personal maid, the little menacing hooks and buttons up and down all through the back, the undergarments. It was a whole, and as Donna just said, everyone corseted so that a bevy of servants on hand to assist with undressing and redressing. And let's remember as well that there was a sewing room in every one of the mansions, wherever the mansions were in Newport or Bar Harbor or New York. And in that sewing room was a full-time servant, a woman, good with a needle, and many times the silk-covered buttons of a gown would need to be completely removed so that the gown could be cleaned, were it to be worn again, which is always a question, perhaps once only is enough. But if it were then cleaned, all those silk buttons, silk covered, would need to be re-sewn. It might be worth mentioning, and this is in the book, that there are very few Cinderella stories of the servant who yearns to marry the rich prince, but one such mender, and it was a full-time job, mender, Mary Lily Keenan, who was in her 30s, and would look over the railing or the parapet when a ball was about to be in play and see all the wonderful gowns and just dream that someday her prince would come. Well, to the Sarah and Pembroke Jones's Wilmington house, no, correction, Newport summer house, came Mr. Henry Flagler in his 70s, rich beyond dreams. He had 2 failed marriages. He was tired. He just wanted to rest. No yachts, please. No balls, no parties for me. I'm very tired. I just want to rest here at Newport. A button popped off his coat, and Mary Lily Keenan was summoned to help sew it on. And he watched her little hands with the needle and thread, and he was charmed, and she looked at him, and he looked at her. And the very next day, according to the story, and the story told by Elizabeth Drexel Lair, whose memoir, and perhaps Donna, you read it, it's a top of mind memoir for the whole Gilded Age. According to Mrs. Lair, the next day, Mary Lily went to her former soon-to-be employer and said, Mrs. Jones, I love Mr. Flagler and he loves me and we will be married. Immediately, she was offered the best suite in the Newport house. Tiffany and the Worth couturiers in New York City for the summer were brought up to Newport to start to outfit her for her wedding and for the trousseau that she would need as Mrs. Henry Flagler. It is the only one of the true Cinderella stories. Mr. Flagler built her a 55-room mansion near Palm Beach, which is open to the public now. And the Keenan fortune, she inherited the Flagler fortune upon his death about 13, I think, years later. It might be 11, I'd have to look. And the Keenan fortune went on to fund many, many philanthropies on. So this is, Peter, I've taken us far off the costumes and the sewing room and the buttons, but there had to be one full-time mender, not a seamstress, but somebody to make repairs for all that clothing 6 times a day in and out.
Yeah, not to mention their travel. If those dresses traveled out of the house, they traveled through the streets of New York. And I think there's 1 or 2 scenes where you see I think it was Agnes Brooke, I think it was Christine Baranski's character, furiously striding across the street, enraged about something, and you really see the gown in the dirt of the street, and that was the reality. So, you know, the cleaning of these, it's hard to even imagine how these things were
And
carried.
if I have any nit to pick with the series, it's that there's not enough horse manure in the streets. And every time I see those gowns dragging across the streets, I think, oh, those poor servants clean all of this up. So I'm just looking at the time, and there's a couple more subjects that I think we should get to. And one of them, I think, has to be Ward McAllister a little bit. He's very key to this story, as you mentioned a little earlier. Wardy, as he was known, was really the reason why Newport's Newport. He was part of an earlier Southern gentry that had made Newport its summer home. In the 18th century, Newport was called the Carolina Hospital because there were so many Southern planters up there. And so he is from a family that's been going to Newport for generations. His home actually wasn't in Newport. It was the next town north. It was in Middletown, right on the water, right behind what's now the Stop and Shop in Middletown. It's really, it's he that convinces Mrs. Astor that in the frame of English aristocracy, that she needs to have a summer home by the sea. And she does go and purchase a home that still exists. It's now owned by Larry Ellison, called Beechwood, and it's a used house. She doesn't build something new in Newport, but it's Ward that brings her up there, and that's when the Gilded Age really comes to Newport, and it's a real part of it. So I'd like both of you. I was delighted with the casting of Nathan Lane. I couldn't have thought of somebody better to play Ward McAllister than Nathan Lane. So I'd love either of you to talk a little bit about Ward McAllister. As you said, Cecilia, he came to no good end when he writes this tell-all, and even his mystic Rose she takes his advice that you should not for any occasion cancel a dinner party, and she doesn't cancel her dinner party and go to his funeral. She has it instead. So, but they'd really fallen out at that point. So we'll talk a little bit about Ward.
Well, I just want to
Go ahead.
Say, just in reference to Nathan Lane's casting, a number of us were cast in 2019 in preparation for expecting to start shooting in March of 2020. And of course, then the pandemic shutdown shifted all of that considerably. But as I would get word of casting, you know, I was just amazed with all of these incredible actors who were being cast, and so many who had their origins, at least on the stage, and so many I knew from my work on stage. And so at one point I said, "Who's going to be my Wardy?" And they said, "Don't you know, Nathan?" And I said, "Of course." I really I couldn't believe it. I've been in this business for 40 years, and Nathan has been in this business for about as long. And we both tread the boards for a long, long time. We've never done so much as a reading together. And I said, and here we are, two people who've had to fake dancing on Broadway because neither of us are really dancers. We're actually waltzing together, and we're, you know, we're accomplices together in our own way. He was extremely important in her life, and I'm going to let Cecilia sort of take it away at this point, and I can come in later. But I just want to say it was such a thrill to work with Nathan. He's so smart, and he's so funny. He's no one thing, you know. He really knew how to bring all the colors, and he doesn't waste a moment of his time in a scene in terms of what he's trying to pursue and what's in the way of it and how he's going to go about making it happen or trying to make it happen, whether it's charming someone or convincing me to, give up the ghost and go across to go and see Mrs. Russell for the better of all of us. Anyway, please, Celia.
Right. Well, just as I say that, it's terrific to hear this, and wonderful to see that Ward McAllister is one of the crucial actual historical characters in the production. I called him a social engineer. And what I mean by that is that when he came to New York, after having traveled in Europe, seen what the gentry is like in the South, especially assemblies. These were dances every 6 months or a year in which leading families gathered for balls so that young eligible bachelors could meet young eligible brides-to-be, so that the structure of the society remained layered, and the topmost families remained topmost families. When McAllister Ward came to New York, we need to remember another name. Good that he's not in the show. He would have been gone by then. Boss Tweed. All of the scandals of New York. And by this time, we're talking, of course, by the 1870s, the press services would broadcast news of scandals all over the United States. So for instance, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, you would learn that the Tweed ring had skimmed money off this awful New York place, and what a sewer that city must be. Here came Ward McAllister to organize its social patriarchs, and that is the word. Ward McAllister, in league with Mrs. Astor, recognized that a group of elite gentlemen who would form a kind of private stock company of their own, called the Patriarchs, by invitation to their annual ball only. Tickets not transferable. In my book, there is a reproduction of one of the tickets, not transferable, the Patriarchs Ball. And the brilliance of Ward McAllister was to have made Mrs. Astor the special advisor to the Patriarchs. If a patriarch were to transgress, perhaps to rent his opera box to some unworthies, he would be taken perhaps to lunch by another patriarch club member and gently told of his transgression and that he must cease and desist. So they kept a quite tight cadre together. The first 25 became 50, and then there was a certain proliferation, by which time Mrs. Astor was on her throne. And not so by the way, at her annual ball, on the last Monday night in January, the ball would begin in earnest close to midnight, and the dinner would be served between 1 and 3 a.m. Mrs. Astor sat, it was called the Satin Throne, and her nearest, Donna, you have so wisely told us, she did not have close friends, she did not have intimates, but she had many social friends, associates.
Yes.
And the closest of all were invited to sit on that satin, kind of a chaise longue, kind of overseeing the whole ball. That was the summa of the year. And as was said, if you weren't invited to that ball, Peter, you said it, you could say you either had an illness in your family or you were in Europe, because it was too shameful not to have been invited. So Ward McAllister was the engine room of this whole society, and Caroline Astor saw that he saw her and off they went.
He was the engine room and she was the ship of state. Yes, many were the disappointed women who did not get to sit on the chaise at any point during one of her balls. So that was, that was the ultimate of the ultimate, not only to be at the ball, but to be on the chaise. And I cannot miss the occasion to note that some wags in New York, because of all of these various combinations that Ward put together, referred to him as Ward Make-a-Lister, which is just such an apt sobriquet for him. So, and we are sort of drawing towards a time to do some Q&A, but before we go, I do want to make the conclusion that whatever you think of the Gilded Age's ultimate contribution to American history, it's a very vibrant, important part of American history. There's an awful lot going on. It's sort of equal across the ocean is the Belle Epoque in France. Mrs. Astor is a driving pinion of this whole thing. And to a certain extent, I have always felt that had she been in another time period, she would have been the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. She was just that. She was that sort of indomitable soul that all of the men in her life, we don't talk about them anymore, but we're still talking about her, and there's a reason for it. So Jennifer, you want to come back up and we'll do a few question and answers.
No, I don't want to come back up because that means that this conversation is coming to a conclusion, and I don't want it to. This has been so delightful and so fascinating. Thank all three of you for a wonderful evening. I just want to remind us of why the Mark Twain House is hosting this. Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner actually coined the term the Gilded Age, and it was the title of their 1873 book, The Gilded Age. And Cecilia, your book that we're talking about tonight, What Would Mrs. Astor Do, actually starts with a quote from The Gilded Age. To the young American, here or elsewhere, the paths to fortune are innumerable and all open. There is invitation in the air and success in all his wide horizon. So I just want to make sure that we remember that connection between Twain and what we're talking about tonight. And I do also want to say for fans of the Gilded Age TV HBO show, and we're talking about costume and all these details, Cecilia's book is full of detail about how people ate and what they drank and the recreation and sports and just everything that you want to know about this period in history. So I would encourage you, if you hadn't yet made a decision to purchase that book, I think you're probably going to want to now.
And while we're on the subject of Cecilia's writing, she's also written 3 very charming murder mysteries from the Gilded Age, one of which is behind Jennifer and the other 2 are rich in my hand. So if you want to try the fiction, I recommend it.
And we have some awesome audience questions, but I'm going to invoke host privilege before we go on to those and say, we mentioned earlier, Cecilia, I think you said, this is another Gilded Age. Who is the Caroline Astor of our current Gilded Age?
That is the open question, isn't it? I mean, maybe Donna, you could say we have the men. I mean, there's Elon, there's Bezos. The men are. I mean, the men are going into space in their projectiles. Who are the women? Who is the Mrs. Astor? Donna, can you have one?
Well, society is just so different. As Peter made the point earlier, if Mrs. Astor of that time were a current character, a contemporary character, she might very well be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Women did not have that option. So, they put their intelligence and their drive and their ambition into driving the social world and the social life of their families and the connected families, and supporting art and charities and worthy causes. So it's hard for me to come up with a modern time equivalent, because to me, the women who might, a woman who might have been in that position would be doing something else. So
That's a good point. I think you've hit
Yeah.
the nail on the head with that. The CEO of and also funding philanthropies through corporate foundations and so on. You've hit it for us. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you. So one of the most popular questions tonight was originally posed by LaDonna Brandon in our audience. And thank you, audience, for your great questions. A number of people have asked that this be the number one question. Cecilia, would you please share how you conducted research for your book and how did you find the details?
First of all, I've been at it for a while. All right. I am sort of steeped in. So if in the classroom you've been teaching this period for a long time, you have a certain foundation. But for anyone who is interested in getting more than ankle deep into that water, there are memoirs by Gilded Age, mostly women. Elizabeth Lair, a woman who called herself Michael Strange. She's one of the Gillette family. These are women who lived their young lives through the Gilded Age, and then as older women, perhaps in the 1930s, and it's Prohibition, and it's the Depression, and they're looking back and they're asking, what was that all about? Elizabeth Lair, for instance, remembers her father home from the Drexel banking wars with J.P. Morgan. She said, a man with fine eyes who was so tired after a day on Wall Street that he would often fall asleep at the table. This sort of glimpse into the personal life, into the arduousness of what Wall Street put a man through, why they died of heart attacks at such an early age, including the Vanderbilt men. These sort of memoirs gave me an enormous gift that I think I was able to bring to the book. I hope I did. That I would say, if you want to get out of the general just histories and the railroads, and you want to get into how people saw their lives, those memoirs are terrific.
And there really are some wonderful quotes. You're absolutely right. The Elizabeth, the Lair biography is wonderful, but we have so many erudite observations on that time period. Edith Wharton makes tons of them, and one of my favorites, which I actually plucked out here, and I'll read it. Wharton had a lot of criticisms of the period, and one of my favorites is, I wish the Vanderbilts didn't retard culture so very thoroughly. They are entrenched in a sort of thermopylae of bad taste from which apparently no force on earth can dislodge them. You can't go any deeper than that. And that was in a letter to a friend. That was in a letter to a friend. So.
And I'll just follow up. If for people who are interested in this, is there a central repository? Where are most of these letters and memoirs? Are they in a central location if somebody wanted to go and read them, or are they scattered through various institutions and archives?
Gosh, they're all over the place, Cecilia. One of the great repositories, and I encourage you, if you're in Newport, Donna, to look up the Newport Historical Society, which has amazing photographic resources, including, I can't remember the name of it, but there was one real shutterbug amongst all of the 400 up in Newport. And he was the one who was allowed to take photographs of the 400 at play. And you'll see them smiling and frolicking and not being so stiff and formal. And I can't, it was Henry O. Havermeyer. It was the Havermeyer album. And that's a great thing to go look at. It really is terrific.
Thank you, Peter. And while we're talking about the 400, there are a couple of questions about the 400. First of all, the ongoing question is to what did was it the number of people who could fit into so-and-so's? So where, and also, were there any people of color in the 400?
No.
No. Okay. Dispense with that one, but
yeah, and it's very interesting how the series brings in a really interesting storyline along those lines, and one that I really accept rather fully.
Yeah, I'm really proud of that element in the storytelling, which, again, that's historical. That was happening, but we've seen little to no representation of a Black elite, Black educated people at that time. I mean, we know a bit about Booker T. Washington, perhaps, but it's the investment that they've made in that part of the storytelling, I think, is fascinating and not gratuitous in any way. I don't feel like it's trying to serve a need simply because of what's happening right now. It's way overdue, and also you just see that in these very different home settings and very different individuals, the family dynamics and the conflict within families is an ongoing theme, regardless of your background. Of course, with many different kinds of things influencing who you are, who your family members are, and what's at stake for you. But the 400, I know that there was this sort of rumor, if you will, which has continued through time, that it was how many individuals would fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom, and that was never it.
No.
Cecilia, what's your belief is the sort of takeaway of what that number was
Well,
about?
there's a couple of things there. I want to hear what Cecilia says, but I've heard one too. Maybe
well,
we've
I'm just going to
together.
say it quickly. A reporter from the New York Tribune asked Ward McAllister, something about who is society, and McAllister, quick, said 400 who will fit in Mrs. Astor's ballroom comfortably. Any more than that will make everyone uncomfortable, he more or less said. That is, those who belong would not like these outre people to be among them, and the outre people would certainly be made ill at ease in the presence of the elite. McAllister, was asked to come up with the list. There have been a number of histories that purport to publish the list. McAllister came up with 300 and some, claiming that others were away, but that number just stuck.
And certainly it was a relatively comfortable number for Mrs. Astor's ballroom. So there's no doubt that actually did kind of work out. But there was a historian who multiplied out the Society of Patriarchs and determined that it came to that number that was close to 400 when it sort of, you talked about it expanding out, Cecilia, and that perhaps that's how Ward ended up with the 400.
Maybe.
That it conveniently fit into the ballroom, but that it also had been those original Society of Patriarchs expanded out later on, because some of them were allowed to invite others and so forth and so on.
Yes.
Well, it stuck. Here we are all talking about
it. Right. We're still talking about it.
Talking about the 400.
50 years later. So it's amazing.
So there are a lot of questions. Many of them have to do with the show. And I think maybe we'll leave some of those to be addressed later. But I'm going to do we have time for two more questions? And one of them is for you, Donna. A number of people want to know, how did Donna pick the voice and dialect she used for Mrs. Astor? And the poser, the original poser, says, by the way, you look beautiful.
It's interesting because I was talking with my daughter and with another friend about the fact that we don't have recordings of that time. We can only imagine and also be somewhat analytical about how certain sounds might have evolved and come out of mouths in one fashion with one person, in another fashion with another. So, you know, there is a term, mid-Atlantic speech, which, you know, if you watched films from the 30s and the 40s, a lot of the actors who were American actors used this sort of, it was slightly heightened. It wasn't British, but there were a lot of dropped R's, a number of other things I could bore you with the particulars of, but and in talking with our director, our producer, with Julian, our creator, we all decided that there's an elevation to the speech. There was a European influence. There was certainly a British influence. She'd been educated in Europe, Caroline, and spoke a number of languages. And I think that based on the research that our dialect coach had done, along with my own, we arrived at a certain approach to the elocution. We were very specific about how to approach certain consonants and certain vowels. And there were certain things that were like, you know, it could go this way, it could go that way. If anybody can take it a little further, it's Caroline. So no, there's no one on the series who's talking quite as I like to say, as affected as Caroline is. But and as for her voice, it's not like I decide upon a voice. It's something that in doing the research, in reading through the nature of the different elements of her circumstances, in looking at photographs of her, and thinking about, again, what she's choosing to present. And what, since she was a little girl, you know, the girls were raised to be presented as, you know, candidates, worthy candidates, and a wife that you would want to create heirs with, you know. And so I think it's the approach to speech and the approach to presentation and how she holds herself, all those things, is very, very deliberate. And she's not somebody who is ever going to, I mean, I shouldn't say never say never, and certainly not in her own home, or perhaps in an argument with her husband that we, you know, haven't seen. And even I remember shooting a scene with wonderful Amy Forsythe, who plays my daughter Carrie, plays Mrs. Astor's daughter Carrie, and we have an argument. We're arguing about the possibility of her having been disinvited to the Russell's ball, and I ad-libbed, you know, an extra, like, shouting out of her name, Mrs. Astor's version of shouting out. And after I did that take, I said, oh my God, did I raise my voice too much? And Michael Engler, who was directing that episode, he said, no, I thought it was perfect, because it was just enough of an elevation. You would never see her do that in public, never. But it was, you know, a little bit of a loss of the control, because she saw that her daughter was challenging her and walking out on her, and it was a kind of behavior she'd not experienced from her baby. She was her baby girl. She had, her youngest was actually John Jacob Astor. So it's a process in terms of arriving at a voice and arriving. I work with the dialect coach. He's on the set all the time for all of us. He will come up to us between takes and say, now just be careful. You know, there's a little bit of an intrusive R there, or that got to be a little bit too British. We don't want it to be British. And we had we had a few British actors. We had an actor from New Zealand, an actor from Australia. They said the trickiest thing, like, doing a contemporary American accent was much easier for them than playing this something that lies in between, you know, the sounds that we associate with Great Britain or particularly England, and an American sound. And of course, American sounds, there are so many different dialects. So anyway, I hope
Fascinating.
sheds.
Now, Cecilia, is there anything you would add to that?
It was wonderful, wonderful
yeah.
to hear. Wonderful. Just no, terrific. I mean, are we not all on our cloud from this
Right?
wonderful hour we've had? Whoa, I'm on.
And we could keep going, and we do have some more audience questions, but it is getting to be time to wrap things up. So I would just invite each of you to share one more thought if you'd like to, or make a point that maybe we haven't gotten around to, or just whatever you'd like to do at this point. Peter?
I am just so pleased that both of you came tonight and participated in this. It's been wonderful to have you here. I don't really have any last thoughts, but I'm sure you do.
Well, I would just say the opportunity to have the presiding presence in my book, the title character, here with us to explain all the conceptions of development of character, of what it takes to read multiple times a script to get into it. It's so interesting. I think those of us who see a television production or a stage production really have no idea. We're really looking at the tip of an iceberg, and below that is the 90% of preparation, and we see the topmost part. So thank you, Donna, and thank you, Peter, for this terrific evening that you've helped us discuss. Love it.
Well, it's truly my pleasure. And I mean, you are one of the sources, literally, have been one of the sources for me. And as I said, I love research because for me, my life as an actress has been a life of constant learning and constant widening my perception of the world, of different times, of different cultures. And it just, it widens my own sense of humanity and understanding of humanity. And of course, my job as an actress is never to judge the character I'm playing. It's to be inside of that person and pursue their needs and protect what's important to them. And she had a lot that she was, I get the sense, Mrs. Astor was really trying to protect a lot in what she had been a part of creating. And I find her fascinating to play. I think that just the care that's being taken with the series has been such an honor to be a part of. And I see, because we're getting ready to start production on our second season, as they're in pre-production. We've read through 3 of the first 5 scripts. We'll be reading 2 more of. We do these virtual table reads, which we'll read 2 more scripts this Thursday with full cast. And it's so exciting to know we get to keep telling the story. And it's just to talk to people who are experts in this field. It gets me excited. It's what fills me and allows me to then take all of that and then let my imagination, do its job. And it's the joy of being an actor to be able to step inside the world, the shoes, the minds, the hearts of these people. And when it's a historical character, as I said, there is a responsibility. And it's wonderful to be able to actually find this woman said these things. She stood in this room. She, I haven't handled something that she's handled, but she wore something almost exactly like this. She said these words to her daughter. We're not doing things verbatim, but that's not the type of script it is. But there are certain things that they are taking right from what we've read historically, and there's a privilege in that, and I feel very, very blessed blessed in this moment and blessed to be a part of the Gilded Age.
Well,
Well-
I'm sure I speak for everybody when we say we're looking forward to the next season.
Great.
I certainly am.
I just want to point out, because Cecilia mentioned iceberg and tip of the iceberg, a week from Thursday, the Mark Twain House is offering another virtual program about the sinking of the Titanic. That's the anniversary of it. And of course, John Jacob Astor, the fourth, I believe, was aboard and went down with the ship. So perhaps people will want to tune in and check out marktwainhouse.org to see information about how you can register for that. I cannot thank you enough for a delightful evening. Folks, click the link and purchase this book, or click the other link and get this and the Gilded Age cocktails. Peter, can you hold up your copy of that again, please, for us? And all of you, thank you so much. Cecilia and Donna, what a privilege and an honor it's been to share this evening with you. And please don't be strangers. We'd love to have you back.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you. Good night, everybody. And thanks to audience for your great questions and for being
Night.
here with us tonight.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much. It was so much fun. I can't hear it.
Donna, if you're interested in seeing some of those photo albums, I'll email you.
Okay. All right. Email me. Thank you, guys. Have a great night.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much. It was great to meet you. And great to see you again, Cecilia.